I think we have to go back to 2014, which is when Russia first invaded Ukraine. This has already happened. So it annexed the Crimean Peninsula, which is in the south of Ukraine. And it also started what was a sort of low-level civil war in the eastern parts of Ukraine, in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which is the eastern part of Ukraine. And at that moment in time, the reaction from the West was, well, how can I put it diplomatically, pathetic. There was some very weak sanctions. There were some words of condemnation. Russia was kicked out of the G8, which it didn't really care about. And that was it. And so I think what the people who run that country learned was, we can do this with impunity. And this is, I think, the right time that we should just break down what he said. It was an extraordinary thing. I don't think anyone in the West has ever seen anything like it. This was a president of a country who spent an hour on national television talking about history. The first 40 minutes of his speech, he talks about the history of Russia and the history of Ukraine. And his argument essentially is that the existence of Ukraine is a historic mistake. It should never have existed. The existence of Ukraine is the result of a series of weak decisions made by various Soviet leaders, starting with Vladimir Lenin and then Nikita Khrushchev and others. The mistake, as he sees it, is that the Russian people, the Russian nation, which was embodied in the Soviet Union, it was artificially split up. And a portion of the Russian nation was put together with what he called pieces of former Poland and Hungary, and put together into one country, which became Ukraine. So in his view, Ukraine is a mistake. It shouldn't exist. He claims in that speech, and also in the speech that he gave this morning, essentially justifying the invasion, that Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine are being genocided. I'm not exaggerating. This is the word he used. He says there's a genocide happening. I mean, my family live in southern and eastern Ukraine, and they're Russian speakers. If there was a genocide happening, I think I'd probably find out about it. So the first thing to say is, he explained that essentially the Russian nation was split up. A piece of Poland and Hungary and other countries was glued onto a piece of Russia and made into a country. And these are historic mistakes that he says are sort of understandable in difficult time that the country was in at the time, but we cannot be held by decisions made at that time by weak leaders who made these weak decisions. So the first thing that you should know, this is why the invasion was always going to happen, because he's essentially explained that the Ukraine shouldn't exist. He also made some other points along these lines, which is essentially that the Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, took on all of the entire Soviet debt, and it paid it off, and left, as he sees it, to Ukraine and other countries of the former Soviet Union, this great Russian inheritance, the land that Russian people had conquered over centuries, the great technological achievements, the manufacturing, the shipbuilding, all of that. So one of the points he makes is, he said, look, in Ukraine, in one of the southern ports, they've just shut down a shipbuilding yard, which was the foundations of which were laid by Catherine the Great, the Russian Tsar or Tsarina, or whatever you call her in English. So what he's saying is, we, the Russians, we gave you this stuff. We gave you this great culture, this land, these technological advancements, and you've squandered them. He says that the West is meddling in the affairs of Ukraine. The West is meddling in the affairs of other Eastern European countries. The West is expanding NATO, which he says they say is a defensive alliance, but actually this is a way of putting rockets and missiles, and he goes through all the different rockets and missiles that the West already has and is developing. They want to put them all around Russia so that they could strike at the heart of Russia at any moment. So he is literally saying that Ukraine is planning an offensive against these eastern regions. And the other thing that he says is essentially the West is about to attack. I mean, he doesn't mince words about it. He literally says that. He says the West is getting ready. It's putting nuclear and other sort of missiles in position to strike against us. And we must defend ourselves. Now, how you defend yourself by moving your borders closer to NATO, I don't really understand, but that is the argument. This paranoia about the West has always been a feature of the Russian mindset. It's not something that is going away. And if you could say, well, look, if the West had just stayed out of it, everything would be fine. That isn't true. I mean, the same way that Ukraine is being invaded now, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these are countries that have Russian-speaking minorities that can be weaponized in exactly the same way as the one in Ukraine is. These are countries that used to be part of the Soviet Empire after they were conquered and annexed by Stalin. While Europe was busy with Hitler, Stalin took all of Eastern Europe basically for himself, including those countries. Russia was always going to try and expand, and this is what people in the West really don't understand, is this isn't about NATO being aggressive causing it. It's the West being weak that's causing it. The reason Vladimir Putin is doing this is he knows that the West is divided. The West is distracted. The West spends more time talking about pronouns than it does about things that matter. There's a mind virus that has spread into their brains that means that they're not capable of focusing on the things that matter. And this has been going on for decades. They're teaching people to hate the West. They're teaching people to hate this country. They're teaching people to hate our values. And how can you possibly defend values that you despise? Why would you fight for democracy if you think democracy is evil? Why would you defend our liberal capitalist system if you think it's evil? You want to be run by Russian? Who do you want to be? Who do you want the world to be run? It's going to be run by someone. You need to pick a team and start to go back to some very sensible ideas about right and wrong, about who we are as people, about what we believe. And remember, look, geopolitics is just a competition. That's all that it is. And if you don't want to fight and you don't want to play in that game, someone else is going to play and fight in that game instead of you. This shows you that NATO's over. People are, when we talk about this, people go, well, I don't want to go and die in Ukraine. Like, I was talking to my wife. My wife's Ukrainian, this morning. And she was saying, well, I really hope the West does something. They need to be strong. And I'm like, yeah, I agree with you. But, you're 7 months pregnant. Do you want me to go and fight in Ukraine? She's like, no. Well, if you don't want your husband to go and die in Ukraine, whose husband should go and die in Ukraine? Whose son should go and die in Ukraine? No one. No one wants to. No one in the West wants to go and die in Ukraine, right? But Ukraine is not part of NATO, right? But this is why I'm saying NATO is over. Okay, let's say he invades Ukraine, we protest, we put sanctions in place, whatever. He invades Lithuania. What, is that different? You want to go and die and fight in Lithuania? If you destroy your own civilization from the inside, the punishment is coming. If you spend your life worrying about this comedian who made the wrong joke, or this, are men women or are men, or which bathrooms do we use? If you spend your whole life worrying about things that happened 400 years ago that were done by people who may look something like you against people who look like those people over there, you're going to be distracted from the business of reality. This is one of the reasons I'm actually somewhat optimistic today. If there's one note for optimism, it's this: we've been living in a dream world, all of us in the West. And I hope that the wool has been lifted from people's eyes somewhat. We don't live in this magical world of diversity, equality, and gender non-binary shit. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin aren't worried about how to maintain peace in the international community. They're worried about doing what they think is the best thing for their country. And until people in America and people in the UK understand that it's our job to think in the same way, to defend our values, to remember what they are. If you approach a random person on the British or American street and say to them, what are British or American values? They'd run away from you like you're trying to recruit them into the EL. No one knows what they are, and people are terrified of defending them, defining them, let alone defending them. We have an absence of leadership. The caliber of Western politicians, I mean, it's pathetic. Nigel Farage, when he was on the show, he made this joke about Liz Truss, some woman who's become foreign secretary, and he's right. She went over to Russia. She didn't even know Russian geography. And these are the people that are negotiating on our behalf with, you can make your criticisms of Vladimir Putin. The one thing I would not ever say about him is he's not a stupid man. No. He's not a stupid man. And the people that he chooses to work with him are not stupid people. Xi Jinping is not a stupid man. And the people that work for him are not stupid people. The people who are there, and I'm not saying Liz Truss is foreign secretary because of diversity. I'm just talking about the broader context here. you know, if you choose the best people, you're going to end up with the best people. And if you choose people based on what looks right and what sounds right and who's never said the wrong thing and who's never made an offensive joke and all of that, you're going to end up with small people, people who never say or have an original thought, people who are afraid to express themselves openly, people who are afraid to call a spade a spade. I mean, this is why people hated Trump, because in many things, he just said it like it is. Like ordinary people think it is.
Yeah.
You know, for example, people got upset about his comments about Mexicans and something about how some of them are rapists and blah, blah, blah. Well, to a lot of ordinary people, when they see a mass wave of illegal immigration coming over the border, they know for a fact that some of those people are criminals, right? So when everyone had this massive, you know, falling out over that, I was like, well, that's true, you know? There's not to say that all Mexicans are bad people, which is what people made it mean. But that's not what he was saying at all. He was talking in a way that people process the world. Russia has never had a single democratic transition of power in its entire history. Ever. Ever. There's never been a time when power has passed from one president to another in a normal, transparent, democratic way, where the Democrats have handed power over to the Republicans. The Tories have handed power over to Labour. That has never happened in the entire history of Russia, democratically. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, Boris Yeltsin became president after what was effectively an overthrow of the government, right? He was president for about 8 years. And then what he needed to do was he needed to find somebody who was not already part of the power structures, somebody who was not already a politician, because anyone who already had any measure of power, the moment Boris Yeltsin left, they would take away all the money that he'd stolen. They would deprive him of all his possessions. They probably put him in prison for the crimes that he'd committed, etc. And so Boris Yeltsin needed to find someone who was an outsider, to whom he could give the power and say, look, here is all the power that you've ever dreamed of and all the money that you've ever dreamed of. And in exchange, you let me live out my life in peace. And that's what happened. What he did is he appointed this guy that nobody had ever heard of, called Vladimir Putin. He appointed him prime minister, not president, but prime minister, acting prime minister for a period of time, during which he basically bigged him up. And then at some point he said, look, my health's not very good. I'm going to take a step back and let this young man take over and look after the country until the next election. And then at the next election, the people can choose whoever they want, right? And of course, once Putin became acting president in this way, you know, he was always going to win the election because he'd been set up to do it. Then he became president. He was president for several terms. When his constitutional right to remain president ended, they did a switcheroo. He did exactly the same thing that Boris Yeltsin did with him, with Dmitry Medvedev. And so Medvedev became president and Putin became prime minister. They swapped around. And during the Medvedev presidency, the constitution was amended to allow Vladimir Putin to serve more terms and longer terms. And then they swapped back around immediately afterwards. So Putin then became president again. So Vladimir Putin, today, we are sitting here in February 2022. He has been in power in Russia since 1999. As to his background, he is the former head of the KGB. If you don't know what the FSB, the KGB, they are the successor to the secret police of the Soviet Union, which was the CHK, the Emergency Committee. Essentially, the KGB were the equivalent of the Gestapo. They are the people the secret police who would torture people, who would put them in prison, who would put them in concentration camps, who organized mass murders. And unlike in Nazi Germany, where the Gestapo and all elements of the Nazi machine were eradicated, that's not happened in the Soviet Union or in Russia in particular at all. The prisons are still there. They still use the same prisons that they used to use in the 30s and 40s to murder and torture people. The people who run Russia are the ideological successors to the Russian Gestapo. The reason Germany's so pathetic on this issue is that they've made themselves hostage to Russia's gas supplies when they shut down all their nuclear reactors purely on ideological basis, as we are trying to do in the rest of the West and with this green shit that is going on. We're making ourselves energy dependent on our strategic adversary. I find the last few days very humbling, actually, because I've watched a lot of people that I normally agree with about things to do with the culture and the culture war and so on, really embarrass themselves very badly. And a lot of people are really embarrassing themselves at the moment because they are reacting instinctively to their pre-existing conceptions of how the world is. And you know that I am the #1 critic of the mainstream media in this country and in the West, but it's their perception that the media keeps lying to them, which it does, and therefore anything the media says is then automatically not true. Well, that isn't the case. The fact that the media reported something doesn't mean it's not true. It means you have to be skeptical about the way it's being presented, and you have to look deeper. They're not telling you the full picture because they don't understand the full picture themselves.